Hello everyone, welcome to Chapter 6, Part 1, The Basics of Behaviorism. This chapter we're going to talk about the process that we use to acquire new information. And there's an entire field of psychology devoted just to try to understand this basic system. And one of the major fields of thought in psychology is the school of behaviorism. The behaviorists were a group of psychologists that really believed that studying things like the mind or emotions or cognitions weren't really very scientific. And instead they concentrated just on observable behaviors and the environmental events or stimuluses that modified our behaviors. And through this they developed an entire process of what they called classical conditioning and operant conditioning, which they believed were the two major ways that we learned new information. Now, before we dive into the elements of the school of behaviorism, I want you to take a look at each of these examples that I have here on the screen right now. And I want to ask yourself, is this actually a form of learning? First, we have a girl who jumps when she sees a snake. Second, we have a young girl who knows that girls should play with dolls from watching commercials on TV and seeing other girls play with dolls on those commercials. Third, we have an older woman who tries to stay on the first floor of her house because she's terrified she might fall and break her hip, kind of like a woman that she saw do this also on television. And finally, we have a boy throwing a temper tantrum to get the toy he wants in a toy store. Now, write down really quick, just on a piece of paper, for your response to each of these four items, whether or not you think it is learning. Now, pause the video to take some time to do this if you want to. Okay, let's start with the first one. So, a girl jumps at the sight of a snake. So she's jumping, I'm assuming, of course, in fear. Yes, this is absolutely a form of learning. This is what we would call a phobia, or a fear of a specific stimulus. And you acquire this through a learning process, usually by having a bad experience with the thing that you're afraid of. So if you're jumping at the sight of the snake, it's very likely you have what we call a classically conditioned phobia. Something about the snake has scared you, or very likely you've had a bad experience with snakes before, and as a result you're terrified of them. So this is absolutely a form of learning. Our fears are very much learned through the environment. Second, we have a young girl who believes that by watching television commercials, that she should emulate the behavior of the girls that she sees on TV. Yes, this is absolutely a form of learning. We learn these behaviors from various sources of information in our environment, especially the television. Children are particularly susceptible to influence from television, so they watch people behave in a certain way on TV, they will try to emulate that behavior. And this holds true largely also for adults. So an older woman is going to show a similar fear response. She's terrified of falling and breaking her hip alone in the house because she's seen women on TV fall and break their hips in television shows, like the Life Alert commercials they have where a woman falls and says she can't get up anymore. So yeah, this is both of these middle two bullet points are what we call observational learning. And it's a special kind of learning that occurs just by watching the behavior of somebody else. And we'll talk about that at the end of our lecture on behaviorism. Last but definitely not least, we have a boy throwing a temper tantrum in a toy store to get the toy he wants. Of course, this is a form of learning, especially if the parent caves in and then buys the child the toy as a result, rewarding the behavior, which means, of course, that it's more likely to happen again, because this is what we would call operant conditioning, which just means you modify the frequency of a behavior, how often a behavior occurs, by either rewarding that behavior or punishing it. Now, so, these are each different forms of learning, and we're going to talk about all of these through the lens of the school of behaviorism in this chapter. Now, let's start out by defining learning. We're going to just say, to be honest with you, there are lots of different definitions of learning that you could use. And we're going to just define this according to the rules of the school of behaviorism for now. We're going to assume that learning is any relatively durable change in behavior or knowledge that is due to experience. So we acquire knowledge and we alter our behaviors based off of the experiences that. According to the behaviorists, the process that we learn by really has a lot to do with the influences of our environment. For the behaviorists, remember, these people don't necessarily believe that you have a free will, and they believe that you don't necessarily need to worry about studying internal emotional states. You just focus on studying things that you can see, observable behaviors. From the behaviorist perspective, there's a series of different processes through which experience is then going to influence our behavior and transform it. Now, this really has a lot to do with when it comes to those processes. That has a lot to do with operant conditioning and classical conditioning and observational learning, but we'll get to those in just a second. And again, they're only going to explain learning purely in terms of observable events. So the only way they can tell if you've learned something is if they see you experience something and then it changes your behavior as a result of that experience. Now, behaviorism has a set of assumptions. These are just ideas they believe or hold to be true when they try to explain the world. The first major assumption that they make is determinism. They assume that, in other words, behavior is completely initiated by some environmental cause. We don't have free will. We don't have the ability to choose what we want. We are largely under the influence of the external world or the environment around us. Next, they assume that mental explanations are completely ineffective. That means when you're trying to describe someone's behavior, referring to things like internal ideas, memories, or emotional state, those are things that you can't see, and if you can't see them, you can't really test them or run experiments on them. And as a result, they're not particularly useful in developing a scientific explanation of the world. In other words, let me put this in just a slightly different way. Behaviorists are more interested in describing what people do and not what people are trying to do or what they are feeling. So they don't care about goals. They don't care about action plans. They don't care about cognitions at all. They care really about what they can see people doing. Now, this threw out a lot of the work that had been done in psychology before the behaviorists. While that was a little bit problematic for the school of behaviorists and would eventually come back to sort of bite them in the butt, what was useful about the school of behaviorism is it kind of dragged psychology kicking and screaming into the realm of empirical investigation and really forced psychologists to become better scientists. By studying observable behaviors, psychologists were able to use a lot of really solid empirical methods to investigate the way that people basically behave, and this kind of scientific rigor carried over into new fields of psychology after the school of behaviorism really lost a lot of power. Finally, this is the third assumption of the school of behaviorism. They assume that the environment is the ultimate determinant of behavior. Really, the power in changing behavior and influencing behavior belongs completely to the environment. It is ultimately, again, here is just a verbal statement of this, it is the greatest or the greater factor in behavior than genetics. When you compare the influence of the environment to the influence of genetics on how people act, for the behaviorists, the genetic explanation really doesn't hold a lot of weight. It's really the environment ultimately that influences who you are and what you will become. Now, if you meet all of these assumptions, you are what we would call a hard-line behaviorist, or a very strict behaviorist, or an extreme behaviorist. And what that means is you only trust environmental explanations for people's behavior. There are many modern behaviorists who don't necessarily hold on to all of these assumptions. While they might prefer environmental explanations, there are a lot of people out there called biobehaviorists who believe that it's the interaction between the environment and your genetic material that influences who you are and what you become. So extreme behaviorists while extreme behaviorists hold all of these assumptions, modern behaviorists do not necessarily agree with every last one of these. Or they would, but not to the extent to which a hardline behaviorist would. Now, the original hardline behaviorist was a man named John Watson. He really championed the school of behaviorism when it was founded, largely thanks to his Behaviorist Manifesto. And here's an old quote of his that sort of sums up the extreme end of the behaviorist school. Now, John Watson really did believe this, and he says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. A doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief. Regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. Okay, I'm going beyond my facts, and I admit it. But so have the advocates of the contrary, and they have been doing it for many thousands of years. Now, what John Watson is saying here is that you take any person, no matter what their background is like, what their genetic makeup is like, or how they were raised, where they come from, and you place him or her, or really any human being, into an environment that you can completely control and regulate any way you want. You can turn that person into anything you want them to be. This is how deeply the extreme end of the school of behaviorism really held on to this belief in the power of the environment to completely shape who we are. Now, again, John Watson is on the extreme end of behaviorism. There are more modern versions of behaviorism that don't necessarily believe that the environment completely controls who we are, or that mental events are unworthy of scientific investigation. But for the most part, old school classic behaviorism really holds on to this. And many modern behaviorists still sort of, turn their nose up at mentalistic explanations of how behavior occurs. Now, the school of behaviorism really concentrates on three things, primarily habituation, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. More modern behaviorists believe in something that we call observational learning, and they believe in something called the social cognitive model. They're kind of at the tail end of the more hard-lined behaviorists. In other words, they're less hard-lined, and they agree with fewer of the assumptions or hold those assumptions less intensely than old-school behaviorists, but they still fall under the category of the behaviorist school of thought. Now, habituation is something that's been studied for a very long time. We'll start there, and then in the next few videos, we'll look at classical conditioning in video 2, operant conditioning in video 3, and then observational learning in video 4. Let's start now with habituation, though. Habituation, let me just kind of throw out some basic information on it. Habituation just means that you have a decrease in the strength of your response to a repeated stimulation. This is something that your nervous system does automatically. It means that if you experience a thing over and over and over and over and over again, what's happening is your nervous system just finds it less interesting and doesn't respond as intensely to it. You do this all the time when regulating your responses to the environment. Now, this is the most basic form of learning we have. It's essentially getting used to something. Let me give you a couple examples of how this works. The one that I have up here on the screen. If you live on a really, really noisy street and you try to go to bed at night, you might, at least for the first couple weeks, have a very hard time getting a good night's rest because the noise of the cars driving by your window at night over and over and over again keeps waking you up, and it makes it very difficult for you to rest. But over time, you kind of start to get used to that sound. Pretty soon, you're able to fall asleep without any problem at all whatsoever. Then you go, let's say, to a friend's house or a family member's house who live in a quieter part of town or a quieter part of the world, and you're there and you don't hear cars outside your window at night, and suddenly you have a hard time falling asleep because you're used to the noise. What's happened is because your nervous system isn't used to the sound of cars zipping by your window all the time, it activates your attention system every time it hears that car going by. And this is just kind of an automatic thing that we do when we hear a stimulus that we're not used to. We have a very powerful nervous system response to it. But the more you continue to expose yourself to the sound of those cars zipping by, you kind of get used to it. It annoys you for a while, but then pretty soon what happens is your nervous system just doesn't respond as intensely. It doesn't activate the rest of your brain as much. It's because your nervous system is basically like, okay, we're used to these cars zipping by, I don't need to make as much of a big deal about it. Eventually, you just get so used to it, your nervous system learns how to filter out the sound of the cars driving by, so you don't even hear them anymore most of the time, unless you're really trying to pay attention to them. Another example of how this works is, let's say you start out the quarter setting your alarm clock to get up really early in the morning to go to class. And maybe some of you have tried this already. You set your alarm clock, it goes off, and you wake up right away. You're up and you're out of bed and you're ready to go. Or you hear the alarm clock and it really, really agonizes you and annoys you and you really wish you could throw it across the room. Well, let's say you get a weekend class. The alarm clock goes off and maybe you have a snooze button on your alarm, so you sort of hit the snooze button and then you sleep in a little bit, then the alarm goes off and you get up and you go about your day again. Another week goes by and the alarm goes off and you get into this habit where you're kind of hitting the snooze button, but you're not consciously aware of it. Or the alarm goes off and it takes longer and longer and longer for your brain to respond to it. Well, what's happening there is you're habituating to the alarm. It means that when the alarm goes off, your nervous system has gotten so used to it, it's no longer creating as much neural activity as it used to. So it's not waking you up and getting you out of bed. One way to fight this would be then to kind of change up when you set your alarm for, kind of within a few minutes, like maybe within 10 minutes of when you normally need to get up. So maybe set it 10 minutes forward one day, then set it 10 minutes back another day. That way you're kind of being unpredictable about when the alarm is going to go off, and it makes it a lot harder to filter the alarm out or sort of learn to ignore it. Now, habituation acts on a variety of different things. You can habituate to noises that are repetitive in your environment. You can habituate to tastes of things. That's why something, maybe if you think of your favorite food, the first time you ever had it, it was amazing and delicious, and you absolutely loved it. But then, if you keep eating that thing every day, eventually you start to kind of get sick of it, and it seems like it doesn't taste as good as it used to. Well, part of that is because it kind of doesn't taste as good as it used to, because you're so used to eating that thing. Your brain has just kind of gotten used to the experience of eating it, so it doesn't activate your nervous system as intensely as it used to. It's one of the reasons that we kind of respond to variety in our diets so positively. And that's why you probably don't want to eat something that you think is really, really delicious for every single meal, so you can continue to enjoy it instead of making yourself sick of it. You can think of maybe songs that you really like. If you listen to them over and over and over again, eventually you get really bored and sick of it, and that's because you've habituated to it. It's no longer very interesting to you. Now, there's a reason that we need to habituate to things. If there wasn't some kind of automatic habituation process, if we didn't start to sort of tune out or tone down certain stimuli, we would become overwhelmed and completely exhausted by every single stimulus we encountered. Because our nervous system would have the same intensity, very high intensity reaction to it that we get when we encounter something brand new that we've never experienced before. I mean, it's good to habituate to things. It helps give your nervous system a break. It helps teach it to know what to expect when it encounters something that's been repeated many, many times. And can you imagine this? Every single time you encounter, for example, a door, having to relearn what a door is, or a window, having to go through the process of being shocked, oh wow, I can look through this thing, it's amazing. It would just get exhausting, and you would tire yourself out just getting up to go and get a cup of coffee, because you would bump into a variety of things, and every time you saw them, you would then react to them as if you had seen them for the very first time. So habituation is a good thing. It helps us filter out things that we are used to, so we can pay attention to the brand new things in our environment. It also allows us to then notice things that do change. So that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to talk about classical conditioning.